Millionaire visits orphanage to bring gifts and sees a boy who looks just like him as a child. What happened next will leave you speechless. The rain hammered against the windshield like angry fists as Michael Johnson fought to keep his Mercedes on the winding mountain road. His eyes were heavy from the business dinner that had run too late. In the passenger seat, Andrea cradled their 6-month-old son Joseph, humming softly to keep him calm through the storm. "Maybe we should stop at the next motel," Andrea suggested, her voice tinged with worry. She reached over to touch Michael's arm, a gesture that had always steadied him. "We're only an hour from home," Michael mumbled, shaking his head to clear the fatigue. The digital clock on the dashboard read 2:17 a.m. He'd made this drive countless times, he thought. Just a little further. Andrea's scream came first, sharp and terrifying. Michael's eyes snapped open to see headlights bearing down on them. He'd drifted into the opposite lane. The world moved in cruel slow motion as he yanked the wheel. The Mercedes fishtailed, tires losing their grip on the rain-slicked road. Andrea's cry pierced through the screech of brakes and thunder. She curled her body around their baby as the car spun toward the guardrail. The impact was deafening. Metal screamed against metal. Glass shattered. Michael reached desperately for his wife and child as the car teetered on the edge of the ravine. For one eternal second their eyes met. Andrea's face, illuminated by the fractured headlights, showed no fear, only love and something else. Something like resolve. "I love you," she whispered. Then the car pitched forward. Michael lunged for them, his fingers brushing Andrea's sleeve before darkness claimed him. The next clear memory was the antiseptic smell of hospital walls. 3 days had passed, they told him. The car had been found at the bottom of the ravine, but when rescue workers reached it, only Michael had been recovered, thrown clear of the vehicle. Andrea and Joseph's bodies were never found, presumed to have been swept away by the raging river below. But in his morphine-hazed dreams, Michael kept seeing Andrea's face in that final moment, that look of resolve. It would be 6 long years before he understood what it meant, 6 years of grief and guilt before he discovered the truth about that rainy night, and learned that sometimes the greatest loss can lead to the most unexpected redemption. Thanks for joining us for this emotional journey of love, loss, and redemption. If you'd like to support more stories that touch hearts and inspire hope, please subscribe to our channel. Every subscription helps us continue sharing meaningful narratives that remind us of the power of family bonds and second chances. Michael Johnson's story began in the crumbling projects of South Boston, where dreams seemed as distant as the gleaming skyscrapers on the horizon. Born to a single mother who worked 3 jobs to keep food on the table, young Michael learned early that survival meant being smarter and working harder than everyone else. At 12, he started his first business delivering newspapers before dawn and collecting recyclables after school. His classmates mocked his worn-out shoes and second-hand clothes, but Michael was too busy counting his savings to notice. By 16, he had enough to buy his first investment, a beaten-up lawnmower. Soon he was managing a small army of neighborhood kids, cutting lawns across 3 districts. High school teachers noticed his exceptional head for numbers and business instincts. Despite working 30 hours a week, Michael maintained perfect grades. His determination caught the attention of Mr. Harrison, a retired real estate investor who became his first mentor. "You remind me of myself," Harrison told him, "but you're smarter. Don't let anyone tell you where your ceiling is." With Harrison's guidance and a hard-won scholarship, Michael attended Boston University's business school. He worked as a night janitor in office buildings, studying lease agreements and market trends while others slept. By day, he interned at a small real estate firm, absorbing everything from property law to negotiation tactics. His breakthrough came during his senior year. While cleaning an office building scheduled for demolition, Michael discovered the property's potential for luxury conversion. He spent 3 months developing a business plan, then boldly presented it to the building's owner. The owner, impressed by the young man's thoroughness and vision, agreed to a partnership. The project's success made headlines in local business papers. By 25, Michael had founded Johnson Properties, specializing in transforming struggling properties into profitable ventures. His approach wasn't just about making money, he insisted on creating spaces that served communities, incorporating affordable housing units and small business incubators into his developments. His reputation for fair dealing and innovative solutions grew. While competitors saw only problems, Michael saw possibilities. He transformed abandoned factories into mixed-use developments, revitalized dying shopping centers, and turned crime-ridden blocks into thriving neighborhoods. Each success built upon the last, and by 30 he had completed projects in every major city along the East Coast. But Michael never forgot his roots. He established scholarship programs for underprivileged students and funded job training initiatives in low-income areas. When asked about his success, he always credited his mother's example of perseverance and Mr. Harrison's mentorship. Wealth isn't just about accumulating money, he often said. It's about creating opportunities for others to rise. At 35, Forbes magazine named him one of the youngest self-made real estate moguls in America. The article praised not just his business acumen, but his commitment to ethical development and community investment. Michael kept the magazine but never displayed it. Success, he believed, wasn't about recognition, it was about impact. Yet, despite his professional achievements, Michael felt something was missing until he met Andrea Thompson at a charity gala. She saw past his wealth to the determined boy from South Boston who still believed in making dreams real. Their connection was immediate and profound, though her brother William, a prominent corporate lawyer, disapproved of the nouveau riche developer pursuing his sister. Michael had conquered poverty and prejudice to build his empire, but winning Andrea's hand would prove to be his greatest challenge and ultimately his most precious achievement. Little did he know that their love story would lead to both his greatest joy and deepest sorrow, setting in motion events that would test everything he had built and believed in. Andrea Thompson was everything the Boston elite valued: old money, impeccable education, and social grace. As the daughter of a federal judge and a philanthropist mother, she'd grown up in a world where reputation meant everything. Yet, from their first meeting at the Children's Hospital fundraiser, she was drawn to Michael Johnson's authentic charm and unwavering determination. William Thompson, Andrea's older brother and managing partner at Thompson Associates, saw things differently. At their first dinner together, he made his disapproval clear. "My sister deserves someone from our circle," he told Michael privately, swirling expensive scotch in a crystal glass. "Someone who understands our traditions, our responsibilities. Not some developer who got lucky playing with real estate." But Andrea saw what William couldn't or wouldn't. She witnessed Michael's quiet generosity when he thought no one was watching. How he'd stop to help elderly residents at his properties, remember every employee's name, or spend hours mentoring young entrepreneurs from disadvantaged backgrounds. While William saw an outsider reaching above his station, Andrea saw a man whose success hadn't dimmed his humanity. Their courtship became the talk of Boston society. William orchestrated a parade of suitable suitors, hedge fund managers, surgeons, and fellow lawyers. Andrea politely declined them all. When Michael proposed 6 months later, presenting not just a ring but plans for a community center in Andrea's name, she said yes without hesitation. William's opposition turned hostile. He launched subtle investigations into Michael's business dealings, spread whispers at country club gatherings, and even attempted to convince their parents that Michael was merely fortune hunting. But Judge Thompson, after a long private conversation with Michael, gave his blessing. "Character," he told William, "isn't inherited with a trust fund." The wedding was a study in contrasts: Michael's childhood friends from South Boston mingling with Andrea's social register guests. William refused to give the traditional brothers speech, a slight that gossip columnists noted. But Andrea, radiant in her mother's restored vintage gown, had eyes only for Michael as they danced their first dance to At Last. Their first year of marriage silenced many critics. Andrea, rather than being relegated to trophy wife status, became actively involved in Johnson Properties community initiatives. She brought her social connections and organizational skills to Michael's philanthropic projects, creating a powerful partnership that transformed both their business and charitable impact. Even William began to thaw, especially after Andrea announced her pregnancy. The prospect of becoming an uncle seemed to soften his hardened prejudices. At their parents' anniversary celebration, he finally offered Michael a grudging handshake. "Maybe I judged too quickly," he admitted, though his tone suggested he was still reserving final judgment. Joseph's birth should have been the final bridge between the families. For a brief moment, as William held his nephew for the first time, it seemed all past grievances would fade. Michael saw real warmth in his brother-in-law's eyes as he promised to be the best uncle a boy could have. But fate had other plans. The tragic accident that claimed Andrea and Joseph didn't just devastate Michael, it reignited all of William's suspicions and resentment. In his grief, he reverted to his worst instincts, using his legal connections to suggest investigations into Michael's role in the crash. The brother-in-law, who had finally begun to accept Michael, became his most fervent accuser, unable to accept that sometimes tragedy needs no villain. Their bitter estrangement would last years, casting a shadow over Andrea's memory and setting the stage for even greater conflicts to come. Neither man could have imagined how their mutual loss would eventually force them to confront, not just each other, but their own deepest failings and prejudices. Life for Michael and Andrea Johnson seemed blessed in the months before the accident. Their penthouse overlooking Boston Harbor became a warm haven where two worlds seamlessly merged, Michael's entrepreneurial drive and Andrea's graceful sophistication, creating something uniquely their own. Baby Joseph's arrival only perfected their happiness, his innocent laughter echoing through rooms once filled with business discussions. Andrea proved an extraordinary mother, balancing her charitable work with endless hours in the nursery. She refused to hire a full-time nanny, insisting on being present for every milestone. Michael would often return home to find them in the music room, Andrea playing Chopin while Joseph cooed in his bassinet. These quiet moments became his most treasured memories. Their professional lives flourished too. Johnson Properties expanded into sustainable development, with Andrea spearheading an initiative to incorporate green spaces and community gardens into every project. Their joint charity foundation launched programs supporting young mothers in underprivileged areas, a cause close to Andrea's heart since becoming a mother herself. Even William's attitude had softened considerably. He became a regular Sunday dinner guest, bringing expensive toys for Joseph and gradually warming to Michael's presence in family gatherings. During one such evening, he actually praised Michael's latest development project in front of their parents, a moment that meant more to Andrea than she let on. Joseph grew into a happy, curious infant with Andrea's gentle eyes and Michael's determined chin. At 6 months, he was already showing signs of a strong personality, reaching persistently for anything that caught his interest. Andrea joked that he had inherited both his father's business sense and her family's stubbornness. The day before the accident was perfectly ordinary, which made it extraordinary in hindsight. Michael came home early to find Andrea and Joseph in the garden terrace she had created. She was teaching their son about different flowers, his tiny hands reaching for bright petals while she named each one. They had dinner together, made plans for the weekend, and discussed the business dinner Michael would attend the next evening. Andrea insisted on accompanying him to the dinner, even though it meant a late drive home. "We've hardly had an evening out since Joseph was born," she said. "Mom can watch him, but I want him with us. He's such a good baby in the car. Such a simple decision. Such devastating consequences." The aftermath of the crash shattered this perfect world like glass. While Michael lay unconscious in the hospital, William launched his campaign of accusations. He demanded investigations into Michael's business dealings, suggesting financial troubles might have motivated foul play. He publicly questioned why Michael survived while his sister and nephew vanished without a trace. The police investigation cleared Michael of any wrongdoing, confirming his account of falling asleep at the wheel. But William refused to accept these findings. He filed lawsuits, hired private investigators, and used his legal connections to keep suspicion alive. His grief twisted into a vengeful obsession that would poison the next 6 years. In his darker moments, Michael almost understood William's hatred. He blamed himself too. The what-ifs tortured his sleepless nights. What if he'd listened to Andrea about stopping at a motel? What if he'd let her drive? What if they'd stayed home? The perfect life they'd built seemed like a cruel illusion, leaving him with only memories and guilt. Yet even in those desperate times, something in Michael held on to hope. Perhaps it was Andrea's influence, or some deep instinct he couldn't explain. Despite losing everything he loved, despite William's relentless accusations, some part of him refused to believe this was the end of their story. He couldn't have known then how right that feeling would prove to be. 6 years after the accident, Michael Johnson found himself standing outside St. Catherine's Home for Children on a snowy Christmas Eve. The old brick building, decorated with twinkling lights and wreaths, stood in stark contrast to the modern developments that had made him wealthy. He clutched a briefcase full of donation papers, his annual attempt to fill the void December always brought. Elizabeth Barker, the orphanage's director, greeted him at the door. Her weathered face carried the kind wisdom of someone who'd spent decades caring for society's forgotten children. "Mr. Johnson, your generosity continues to overwhelm us," she said, though something in her eyes suggested unease. She'd been unusually hesitant when he'd called about this visit, almost reluctant to accept his offer of Christmas gifts for every child. Inside, the halls buzzed with excitement. Children of all ages darted past, their eyes wide at the mountain of wrapped presents being unloaded from Michael's car. But it wasn't their joy that stopped him in his tracks, it was their loss. Each smiling face carried shadows he recognized from his own mirror, the yearning for family, for belonging, for answers to questions that might never come. "We've prepared the main hall for the gift distribution," Elizabeth said, leading him through corridors decorated with paper snowflakes and children's artwork. She spoke rapidly about the orphanage's needs, about funding challenges and maintenance issues, but Michael sensed she was avoiding something. Her hands fidgeted with her necklace, a nervous habit he'd noticed in previous meetings. The main hall had been transformed into a winter wonderland. A massive Christmas tree dominated one corner, while tables laden with cookies and hot chocolate lined the walls. Volunteers dressed as elves organized presents by age groups, consulting lists with practiced efficiency. Michael had spared no expense. Each child would receive not just toys, but practical items like winter clothes and school supplies. As the children filed in, Elizabeth pulled him aside. "Mr. Johnson, perhaps you'd prefer to wait in my office while we distribute the gifts." Her suggestion carried an almost desperate edge. "The noise can be overwhelming, and I have some paperwork regarding your donation." But Michael shook his head. After losing Joseph, he'd learned to face his pain rather than hide from it. "I'd like to stay, if you don't mind. Maybe even help hand out some presents," he managed to smile, though his heart ached watching the younger children bounce with excitement. Joseph would have been their age now. Elizabeth's face paled slightly, but she nodded. "Of course. Just, perhaps you could start with the older children? The younger ones can be quite overwhelming again," that strange hesitation. Before Michael could question it, she hurried off to organize the gift distribution. The next hour passed in a blur of torn wrapping paper and delighted exclamations. Michael found himself genuinely smiling, watching dreams come true in small ways. A teenage girl clutched art supplies to her chest, tears in her eyes. A young boy practically vibrated with joy over his first real baseball glove. Each genuine thank you helped ease the weight of memories this season always brought. Then he heard a laugh that stopped time. A sound so achingly familiar it couldn't be real. Michael turned slowly, his heart hammering against his ribs. Across the room, a small boy had just opened a remote-controlled car. He held it up triumphantly, his smile illuminating features that belonged in Michael's most treasured photographs. The boy couldn't have been more than 7. His brown hair fell across his forehead in the same unruly way Michael's did in childhood pictures. But it was his eyes that caused Michael's world to tilt. They were Andrea's eyes, down to the tiny flecks of gold around the pupils. The same eyes he'd last seen in the glare of oncoming headlights 6 years ago. Elizabeth appeared suddenly at his side, her face drawn with concern. "Mr. Johnson, are you all right? You look pale." She followed his frozen gaze and seemed to stop breathing for a moment. "Perhaps we should step outside for some air." But Michael couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't tear his eyes away from this impossible mirror image of his past. "That boy," he managed finally, his voice barely a whisper. "What's his name?" Elizabeth's response came reluctantly, heavy with unspoken weight. "Matthew. His name is Matthew." She hesitated, then added, "He came to us as an infant, about 6 years ago." The timeline slammed into Michael like physical force. 6 years, the same brown hair, Andrea's eyes. All at once, the strange tension in Elizabeth's manner made terrible sense. She'd known. Somehow she'd known what this meeting would mean. Michael stood frozen, watching Matthew play with his new remote-controlled car. Each movement, each expression sent shockwaves of recognition through him. The way the boy bit his lower lip, in concentration Andrea's habit. The determined set of his shoulders, a mirror of Michael's own childhood photos. Even his laugh echoed with haunting familiarity. May I speak with him?" Michael asked Elizabeth, his voice barely steady. She hesitated, maternal protectiveness warring with something else in her expression. Finally she nodded, but her warning was clear. "Please remember, he's a sensitive child. He's had difficulties connecting with potential adoptive parents." Michael approached slowly, as if in a dream. Matthew sat alone in a corner, meticulously examining every feature of his new toy. Other children rushed around celebrating their gifts, but he remained in his own world, another trait Michael recognized from his own youth. "Hello, Matthew. That's quite a car you've got there." Michael kept his voice gentle, fighting to control its tremor. The boy looked up, and the full impact of those familiar eyes nearly knocked Michael backward. "Would you mind if I sit with you?" Matthew shrugged slightly but moved over, making space on the window seat. Up close, the resemblance was even more striking. The same cowlick at the crown of his head, the same slight dimple in his left cheek. Michael's hands shook as he sat down. "Do you like cars?" Michael asked, though he already knew the answer. He'd been the same at that age, fascinated by anything with wheels and an engine. Matthew nodded, still focused on the remote. "I used to collect them when I was your age," Michael continued. "Had hundreds of toy cars lined up on my windowsill." This caught Matthew's attention. He looked up, curiosity overcoming shyness. "Really? What was your favorite?" His voice, clear and bright, carried echoes of questions asked long ago in a nursery overlooking Boston Harbor. "A red Corvette," Michael answered, remembering. "It was second-hand, missing one wheel, but I loved it more than any other toy I owned." He paused, watching Matthew's reaction. "What about you? What's your favorite?" "Lamborghinis," Matthew replied, animation creeping into his voice. "The yellow ones. Miss Elizabeth lets me read car magazines sometimes in her office. I like to draw them too." He reached into his pocket, pulling out a folded piece of paper. "Want to see?" The drawing took Michael's breath away. Not just for its subject, though the car was remarkably well rendered for a child's work, but for the style. Andrea had been an artist too, filling sketchbooks with the same fluid lines and attention to detail. Her drawings of baby Joseph had captured that same essence of movement within stillness. "This is beautiful," Michael managed, his vision blurring slightly. "You have a real talent." The boy beamed at the praise, then surprised both of them by demonstrating how his new car worked. His technical explanations, precise and enthusiastic, mirrored countless conversations Michael had shared with Joseph in those precious early months. From across the room, Elizabeth watched their interaction with growing concern. She moved closer, presumably ready to intervene if the emotional weight became too much for either of them. But Matthew, usually so reserved with strangers, seemed to bloom under Michael's attention. They spent the next hour talking about cars, drawing, and Matthew's life at the orphanage. Each revelation felt like another piece of an impossible puzzle clicking into place. He loved chocolate milk but hated orange juice, just like Joseph. He was fascinated by tall buildings, Michael's own childhood obsession. He even had the same habit of running his fingers through his hair when thinking deeply. As the Christmas party wound down, Michael found himself reluctant to leave. The thought of walking away from this boy, this miracle he couldn't yet comprehend, felt physically painful. "Thank you for showing me your drawings," Matthew, he said finally, standing up. "Would it be okay if I visited again sometime?" Matthew's face lit up with hope, though he tried to hide it with practiced casualness. "Sure, if you want to. I could show you my other car drawings then." More quietly, "Nobody else really likes looking at them." Michael's heart contracted. He knew that tone, the voice of a child trying not to want too much, trying not to believe in possibilities that might disappear. He'd used it himself growing up, and he'd heard it in Joseph's first attempts at baby talk. "I'd like that very much," Michael replied, every fiber of his being screaming that this couldn't be coincidence. This connection, this recognition, had to mean something more. As he left the orphanage that night, his mind raced with questions that would soon unlock a mystery deeper than he could imagine. After Michael's departure, Elizabeth Parker sat in her dimly lit office, her hands trembling as she unlocked the bottom drawer of her filing cabinet. Behind years of routine paperwork lay a red folder she'd hoped would never need opening. Inside was a collection of newspaper clippings, a faded note, and a photograph that had haunted her for 6 years. The photo showed a much younger Michael and Andrea Johnson at a charity gala, their happiness radiating through the newsprint. Elizabeth had recognized Michael instantly when he first approached the orphanage with donations 3 years ago. She'd spent countless nights since then wrestling with her conscience, questioning whether her silence was protection or betrayal. That night's interaction between Michael and Matthew had confirmed her worst fears. The resemblance was undeniable, but it was more than physical appearance. Their connection had been immediate, natural, the kind that usually only exists between parent and child. She pulled out the mysterious note that had accompanied Matthew's arrival, reading it again, though she knew every word by heart. Protect him. Keep him safe. Their watching the handwriting was hurried, desperate. Along with it had come documents listing Matthew's birth date exactly matching the timeline of the Johnson tragedy. Elizabeth had done what the note asked, guarding Matthew's true identity while carefully monitoring any adoption inquiries that seemed too probing or suspicious. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. Sarah Miller, the night nurse who'd been with St. Catherine's since before Matthew's arrival, entered quietly. "I saw them together," Sarah said without preamble, her usually calm face etched with worry. "It's time, isn't it? Time to tell what we know." Elizabeth sighed heavily. "If we're right about this, Sarah, revealing the truth could put Matthew in danger. Remember the men who came asking questions that first year? Their charitable organization that didn't exist." She shuffled through more papers in the folder. "And the mysterious car that followed our bus on last month's field trip." Sarah sank into a chair, her shoulders heavy with shared burden. "But he has a right to know his father. And Mr. Johnson, did you see his face today? The pain, the hope." She paused, then added quietly, "I was there that night, Elizabeth. The night Matthew came to us. There was more happening than we understood." Elizabeth's head snapped up. In 6 years, Sarah had never mentioned being present for Matthew's arrival. "What do you mean? What didn't you tell me?" The nurse's face was pale in the office's dim light, her hands clasping and unclasping in her lap. "The woman who brought him, she wasn't just some random Good Samaritan. She wore hospital scrubs and she knew things. Medical details about Matthew's birth, about his mother." Sarah's voice dropped to a whisper. She said something about people who would finish the job if they found him. Then she disappeared into the night. Elizabeth felt a chill run down her spine. She'd always suspected Matthew's placement at St. Catherine's wasn't random, but this confirmation opened disturbing new questions. Did she give a name? Anything we can trace? Sarah shook her head. Only her first name, Amanda, or Amy, something like that. But Elizabeth, she hesitated. She had the same eyes as Mrs. Johnson in that photograph, the same eyes Matthew has. The implications hit Elizabeth like physical force. If Sarah was right, if Matthew's mysterious guardian had been related to Andrea Johnson, it suggested a level of orchestration behind the boy's survival that was both hopeful and terrifying. Someone had gone to great lengths to save him, which meant someone else had gone to great lengths to harm him. We need to be careful, Elizabeth decided finally. Michael Johnson is a powerful man with resources. If Matthew really is his son, he won't stop until he uncovers the truth. But we have to make sure the truth doesn't put Matthew in danger again. She began gathering the documents, forming a plan. We'll watch and wait. See what Mr. Johnson does next. But Sarah, she fixed the nurse with a stern look. No one else can know about this conversation. Matthew's safety depends on our discretion. As Sarah left, Elizabeth returned to the window, watching snow fall on the empty playground. Somewhere out there were answers about the accident, about Matthew's miraculous survival, about the forces that had torn apart and might yet reunite a family. But finding those answers would mean unraveling a mystery that powerful people had worked very hard to keep buried. Keep him safe, the note had said. Elizabeth prayed she was doing the right thing, balancing that mandate against the undeniable pull of truth and justice. As she watched Matthew's light go out in the dormitory wing, she whispered a quiet promise, "We'll protect you, little one, whatever comes next." In the weeks following the Christmas party, Michael became a constant presence at St. Catherine's. His initial request to visit Matthew evolved into a regular schedule of weekend activities that brought life back to both their worlds. Each visit peeled back another layer of their uncanny connection, revealing similarities that went far beyond physical appearance. Their Saturdays began with drawing sessions in the orphanage's art room. Michael brought professional sketch pads and colored pencils, watching in amazement as Matthew's talent flourished with proper materials. The boy had inherited Andrea's eye for detail, capturing not just the shapes of his beloved cars, but their spirit, the way light played across chrome, the subtle curves of aerodynamic design. "My wife was an artist too," Michael said one morning, as Matthew worked on a particularly intricate Ferrari sketch. He hadn't meant to mention Andrea, but the words slipped out naturally. Matthew looked up, curiosity bright in his familiar eyes. "What did she draw?" he asked, adding careful shadows to his work. The question squeezed Michael's heart, but not with the usual pain. Something about Matthew's presence made memories of Andrea feel more like comfort than torture. Everything. Buildings, people, dreams. Michael smiled softly. She filled whole books with drawings of our baby son. The pencil in Matthew's hand slowed, and Michael caught a flash of something in his expression: longing, perhaps, or recognition. Their connection deepened through shared interests and parallel habits. They both arranged their colored pencils in precise rainbow order. Both had a habit of humming while concentrating the same tuneless melody that used to drive Andrea crazy. During lunch breaks, they even reached for their drinks with the same left-handed gesture, though Matthew had been taught to write right-handed at the orphanage. Elizabeth watched their growing bond with a mixture of joy and trepidation. She couldn't deny the positive change in Matthew: his shoulders straighter, his smile quicker, his interaction with other children more confident. Yet she kept the red folder in her desk, a constant reminder of unseen dangers. One rainy Sunday, Michael arrived to find Matthew in tears. Some older boys had torn up his favorite drawing, a Lamborghini he'd worked on all week. Michael sat with him, letting the boy's hurt pour out. Then, instead of their usual activities, he taught Matthew how to rebuild from setbacks. "When I was your age," Michael shared, setting up a fresh sheet of paper, I lost everything I'd saved from my first bike. But instead of giving up, I started again. Sometimes starting over lets us create something even better. Together, they drew a new Lamborghini. Michael's business-trained hand was clumsy next to Matthew's natural talent, but their collaborative effort produced something unique, a child's vision refined by an adult's perspective. Matthew's tears dried as they worked, replaced by determination Michael recognized from his own childhood battles. "It's better than the first one," Matthew declared finally, proudly displaying their joint creation. "Can we hang it in your office?" Like real artwork, the question caught Michael off guard. He'd mentioned his office only once, weeks ago. "Of course we can," he managed, fighting sudden emotion. Right next to my desk, the boy's face lit up with the same radiant joy Joseph had shown at simple pleasures, a mobile spinning overhead, a rubber duck in the bath. Their time together began extending beyond the orphanage walls. With Elizabeth's careful permission, Michael took Matthew to car shows, museums, and parks. Each outing felt simultaneously new and familiar, like replaying precious memories with subtle variations. Matthew shared Michael's love for hot chocolate with extra marshmallows, his fascination with architectural models, even his irrational dislike of pigeons. During a weekend visit to the Science Museum, Matthew slipped his hand into Michael's while watching a planetary display. The gesture was so natural, so right, that neither of them commented on it. But Michael felt the warm weight of that small hand like an anchor, holding him to a present that finally felt worth living in. "Mr. Johnson," Matthew asked later, as they shared ice cream on a park bench, Do you think you'll keep visiting? Even if I don't get adopted," the question carried echoes of past abandonments, of hopes cautiously raised and quietly dashed. Michael's response came from the deepest truth he knew: "I'll always be here for you, Matthew." That's a promise. As the words left his mouth, he realized they were more than comfort, they were a commitment, a recognition of something his heart had known since Christmas Eve. He wasn't just visiting anymore, he was finding his way home. Late one evening, as Michael was leaving St. Catherine's after another visit with Matthew, a figure emerged from the shadows of the parking lot. Sarah Miller, still in her nurse's uniform from her shift, approached his car with obvious apprehension. "Mr. Johnson, I need to speak with you." Her voice trembled slightly, eyes darting around the empty lot. "Not here. Tomorrow morning, 7 a.m., at the Crown Coffee Shop on 3rd Street. Please, it's about Matthew." Before Michael could respond, she disappeared back into the darkness. The next morning, Michael found Sarah already waiting in a corner booth, her hands wrapped around an untouched cup of coffee. She looked like she hadn't slept, dark circles prominent under her eyes. As he sat down, she leaned forward, speaking in hushed tones. "You need to be careful with your visits to Matthew," she began without preamble. "There are people watching the orphanage. Last week, a black SUV followed our bus on the children's outing. The same vehicle has been parked across the street 3 times this month." Michael felt his protective instincts surge. Who's watching? What do they want with Matthew? Sarah's hands tightened around her cup, knuckles turning white. 6 years ago, I was working the night shift at Boston General when a woman brought in a baby boy. She was desperate, terrified. Said people were trying to hurt him. Sarah's voice cracked. The next day, that same baby disappeared from the hospital. 2 days later, Matthew arrived at St. Catherine's. Michael's heart pounded as Sarah continued. "The woman, she looked so much like the photo of your wife in the newspapers. Same eyes, same chin. She made me promise to keep quiet, said lives depended on it. I've kept that promise for 6 years, but now..." Now what? Michael pressed, his mind racing with implications. Sarah glanced nervously at the door before continuing. "Last month, men in suits came to the orphanage. Said they were from a children's charity, wanted to review our records. But their questions focused on children who arrived 6 years ago. Elizabeth turned them away, but they've been back watching." She pulled an envelope from her purse, sliding it across the table. Inside was a photograph, creased and worn. It showed a hospital nursery, and in the background, partially visible, was a woman holding a baby. Though blurry, her profile was unmistakably familiar. "That's the security camera footage from that night," Sarah whispered. "I shouldn't have kept it, but something told me it was important. The woman, she said something about a brother who couldn't be trusted and people who would finish the job if they found them." Michael stared at the photo, his hands shaking. William, the brother who couldn't be trusted. The pieces were starting to align in a terrifying pattern. "There's more," Sarah continued, her voice barely audible. "The woman left a note with the baby. I memorized it before she made me destroy it. Tell Michael the accident wasn't an accident. Keep our son safe." The implications hit Michael like a physical blow. Andrea's last look of resolve in the car. The bodies never found. William's aggressive accusations. It all pointed to an orchestrated plan not to kill, but to protect. "Why are you telling me this now?" Michael managed, his throat tight with emotion. Sarah's eyes filled with tears. "Because the men in suits came back yesterday asking about you. They knew about your visits with Matthew. And last night someone broke into my apartment. They went through my files, my computer. They're getting closer." She stood abruptly, gathering her things. "I've said too much already. Just be careful. Watch for the black SUV. And Mr. Johnson," she paused, her expression grave, "if you really care about Matthew, you might need to stay away. At least until you know who's behind this." As Sarah hurried out of the coffee shop, Michael sat frozen, the photograph burning a hole in his pocket. The accident wasn't an accident. Andrea had known something dangerous enough to fake their deaths, to hide their son in plain sight. He pulled out his phone, fingers hovering over his lawyer's number. But if William was involved, who could he trust? The stakes had suddenly become clear. This wasn't just about reuniting with a lost child. It was about protecting Matthew from whatever threat had forced Andrea to make the ultimate sacrifice. Looking out the window, Michael noticed a black SUV parked across the street. As he watched, it pulled away from the curb, disappearing into traffic. The game had changed, and he was playing for keeps. William Thompson's sleek Bentley pulled into St. Catherine's parking lot 2 days after Sarah's warning. He emerged wearing an impeccably tailored suit, his silver hair catching the morning light. Elizabeth met him at the entrance, her usual warm demeanor replaced by cautious formality. "Mr. Thompson, this is unexpected. How can I help you?" She positioned herself in the doorway, subtly blocking his entry. William's smile didn't reach his eyes as he produced a business card. "Miss Parker, I understand Michael Johnson has been spending considerable time with one of your children. As the executor of my sister's estate and the Johnson Family Trust, I have concerns about his involvement." His voice carried the practiced smoothness of expensive scotch. Elizabeth examined the card, buying time to steady her nerves. "Our visitation policies are confidential, Mr. Thompson. I'm afraid I can't discuss specific children or visitors." "Perhaps this will help facilitate our discussion." He withdrew a check, the amount making Elizabeth's eyes widen. "A generous donation to St. Catherine's. All I need is information about the boy called Matthew." Meanwhile, Michael arrived for his regular visit, freezing at the sight of William's car. Through the entrance window, he watched the confrontation unfolding. Elizabeth stood her ground, handing back both card and check. "Mr. Thompson, our children's privacy isn't for sale. Now, if you'll excuse me," she began, closing the door, but William's hand shot out, holding it open. "You don't understand what you're dealing with," he hissed, facade cracking. "Michael Johnson is a dangerous man. Did you know he was driving the night my sister died, that he fell asleep at the wheel and killed his own family?" Elizabeth's voice turned to steel. "I know that accident was investigated and closed. I also know you're trespassing. Please leave before I call the police." William stepped back, straightening his tie. "You're making a mistake. I have resources, Miss Parker. I can have this orphanage's licenses reviewed, your funding questioned, your personal background examined." Michael chose that moment to reveal himself. Enough, William, his voice cut through the tension like a blade. William turned, his expression flickering between surprise and something darker. Michael, still playing the benevolent philanthropist, or have you found a new family to destroy? William's words dripped with venom. 6 years, William. 6 years of your accusations and investigations. The police cleared me. The courts cleared me. When will it be enough? Michael stepped between William and Elizabeth. When I have justice for Andrea. William's composure shattered. You took her from our family, convinced her to marry beneath her station. Then you killed her and my nephew in that accident. Now you're here. What? Looking for replacements. Michael's next words came quietly, deliberately. Andrea chose me, William. She saw past the class differences you're still clinging to, and she'd be ashamed of what you've become. William moved with unexpected speed, grabbing Michael's collar. Don't you dare speak for her. I've spent 6 years building a case against you. I know you're hiding something about that night. And this sudden interest in an orphan boy? Too many coincidences. Elizabeth's firm voice cut through the confrontation. Security has been called, Mr. Thompson. Leave now, or explain yourself to the police. William released Michael, stepping back. His mask of civilization returned, but his eyes burned with malice. This isn't over. I'll find out what you're hiding, Michael. And when I do, I'll take everything from you, just like you took everything from me. As William's Bentley roared away, Elizabeth turned to Michael. We need to talk. About Matthew. About that night. About everything she led him to her office, where Sarah Miller was already waiting, clutching the red folder. William's right about one thing, Michael said, sinking into a chair. There are too many coincidences. Matthew's age, his appearance, Sarah's story about the woman at the hospital. He looked at both women. I think it's time for complete honesty. Elizabeth shared a look with Sarah before opening the folder. Yes, it is, because William Thompson wasn't just making threats. Last week he filed papers to have Matthew's adoption records unsealed. He's using his legal connections to gain custody rights as the boy's closest living relative. Michael felt the blood drain from his face. He knows. Somehow he knows Matthew is Joseph. But how? That's not all, Sarah added quietly. The men in the black SUV, they work for Thompson Associates. William hasn't been grieving for 6 years, Michael. He's been hunting. James Cooper sat in his dimly lit office, surrounded by 6 years of evidence about the Johnson case. Photos, documents, and newspaper clippings covered every surface, connected by red strings that mapped out a conspiracy more complex than anything in his 30 years as a private investigator. Let me get this straight, Michael said, leaning forward in his chair. You've been investigating Andrea's death since the beginning. Cooper nodded, pulling out a worn leather notebook. Your brother-in-law hired me initially, Cooper admitted, his weathered face grim. He wanted proof you'd orchestrated the accident. But the deeper I dug, the more I realized he was looking in the wrong direction. The accident wasn't about you, Michael. It was about what Andrea discovered. Cooper spread out a series of photographs on his desk. They showed Andrea entering various medical facilities in the months before her death. Your wife wasn't just running charity programs at these hospitals. She was investigating something. Something that scared her enough to fake her own death and hide your son. He pulled out hospital records, carefully annotated in his precise handwriting. 2 months before the accident, Andrea visited 5 different hospitals' pediatric wards. At each one, she accessed files about missing children. Children who disappeared from wealthy families, only to turn up in foreign adoption rings. Michael's hands trembled as he picked up one of the reports. Are you saying Andrea uncovered a trafficking operation? Not just any operation, Cooper's voice dropped lower. These weren't random kidnappings. They were targeted. Every child came from families involved in major real estate developments. Families like yours who were closing deals worth millions. He unveiled a complex chart showing money trails and shell companies. The pattern was clear. A child would disappear. Then suddenly the parents would agree to sell valuable properties at below-market rates. The buyers always traced back to the same investment group, Horizon Ventures. Michael's blood ran cold. William's investment firm, the one Andrea helped audit as part of her charity work. Exactly, Cooper pulled out more documents. But here's where it gets worse. Andrea didn't just find the pattern, she found proof. Bank transfers, coded communications, even surveillance photos of the people involved. She was building a case to take to the FBI. He paused, letting the implications sink in. A week before the accident, she contacted an agent named Sarah Richardson. But the night before their meeting, Richardson was killed in an apparent robbery. That's when Andrea knew she was next. Michael's world tilted on its axis. The resolve in her eyes that night. She wasn't afraid of dying. She was executing a plan. Cooper nodded grimly. A nurse at Boston General, Sarah Miller, helped her stage the disappearance. They made it look like your son's body was lost in the river, while Andrea, he hesitated. While Andrea, what Michael pressed. While Andrea went into deep hiding to continue gathering evidence, she couldn't risk William knowing she was alive, not when he was connected to everything. Cooper pulled out one final photograph, taken just 2 months ago. Though blurry, the woman's profile was unmistakably Andrea. "She's alive," Michael whispered, his voice cracking. "And still fighting to expose the truth. But she's not the only one in danger anymore. Williams figured out that Matthew is Joseph. If he gets custody, he'll have the perfect leverage to silence both you and Andrea forever." Cooper gathered the evidence into a secure folder. "You have 2 choices, Michael. Walk away to protect yourself, or help me and Andrea bring down one of the biggest criminal enterprises in Boston. But decide fast. William's custody hearing is in 3 days." Michael stared at the photo of Andrea, remembering her passionate commitment to justice, her fierce protection of the vulnerable. The choice wasn't really a choice at all. "What do you need me to do?" he asked. Cooper smiled grimly. "First, we need to get Matthew somewhere safe. Then, we're going to set a trap. William thinks he's the hunter, but he's about to become the prey." The investigator pulled out a burner phone. "Andrea's been waiting 6 years to make her move. With you and Matthew in danger, she's ready to come out of hiding. But we'll need to be careful. William has people everywhere, and he's not the only powerful man who'll do anything to keep their secrets buried." Michael thought of Matthew's smile, of Andrea's sacrifice of 6 years lost to lies and fear. His resolve hardened. "Tell me everything. Every detail, every player, every connection. It's time to end this." As Cooper began laying out the intricate web of corruption and crime, Michael realized the true depth of Andrea's courage. She hadn't abandoned them, she'd been protecting them all along, fighting a shadow war against an enemy hidden in plain sight. Now, finally, she wouldn't have to fight alone. Elizabeth Parker sat alone in her office well past midnight, the red folder open before her, its contents spread across her desk like evidence at a crime scene. She'd protected Matthew for 6 years, guided by cryptic warnings and her own instincts. Now, with Michael's revelation about Cooper's investigation, the weight of her knowledge felt unbearable. The security footage from that rainy night played on her computer screen for the 100th time. A woman in nurse's scrubs, carrying a bundled baby through St. Catherine's side entrance. The timestamp matched Sarah Miller's story perfectly, 3:47 a.m., just hours after the reported accident. Elizabeth paused the video on the woman's face, Andrea Johnson, very much alive, entrusting her son to strangers. "Keep him safe," the note had said. Elizabeth had honored that request, screening potential adoptive parents with excessive caution, always finding reasons why Matthew wasn't quite ready for placement. She'd watched him grow, seeing shadows of his parents in every gesture, Michael's determination, Andrea's artistic soul. Her phone buzzed another message from William Thompson's office. The third today, each more insistent than the last. The custody hearing loomed, and William's legal team was pressuring her to testify about Michael's visits with Matthew. They wanted her to paint those precious bonding moments as inappropriate, possibly even harmful to the child. Elizabeth's hand moved to the hidden compartment beneath her desk drawer, withdrawing a sealed envelope she'd promised herself never to open. Inside was a second note, delivered 3 years ago by a woman who looked remarkably like Andrea. When the time comes, the truth will save them all. Was this that time? The evidence Cooper had uncovered about William's trafficking operation made her blood run cold. How many other children had passed through her orphanage, their histories obscured by seemingly legitimate adoption papers? How many times had she unknowingly played a part in William's schemes? A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. Sarah Miller entered, still in her nurse's uniform, carrying 2 cups of coffee. "You're not alone in this," she said, setting 1 cup down. "I've been carrying this secret too." Elizabeth accepted the coffee gratefully. "We thought we were protecting him. But what if we've just delayed the inevitable? William has resources, connections. The judge at the custody hearing is a golf partner of his father's." Sarah perched on the edge of the desk, her face grave. "That's why we need to tell Michael everything. Not just about Matthew's arrival, but about the other children. The ones William's people placed here over the years, who disappeared into foreign adoptions before we understood the pattern." Elizabeth's hands trembled. "If we do this, if we help Michael and Cooper expose the trafficking ring, every child in this orphanage could be at risk. William's retaliation would be less devastating than letting him win." Sarah finished firmly. "Think about Matthew, about the way he lights up when Michael visits, about the drawings he makes of the family he dreams of having. Can we really let William destroy that?" Elizabeth picked up a recent photo of Matthew and Michael taken during their last museum visit. The connection between them was undeniable, not just in their matching features, but in the pure joy radiating from both faces. She thought of all the times she'd seen Matthew watching other children leave with their new families, trying to hide his longing behind brave smiles. "We'll need proof," she said finally. "Documentation of every suspicious adoption, every interaction with William's people. Security footage, payment records, everything." Sarah smiled, pulling out a USB drive. "Already done. I've been keeping copies since that first night. Andrea wasn't the only one gathering evidence." Elizabeth felt a weight lift from her shoulders, replaced by fierce determination. She'd spent her life protecting children, giving them chances at better futures. Now she had the opportunity to protect not just Matthew, but countless other children from William's corrupt network. She began gathering the contents of the red folder, along with years of carefully hidden records. "Call Cooper," she told Sarah. "Tell him to meet us here before dawn. And contact Michael. He needs to understand exactly what he's up against before the custody hearing." As Sarah left to make the calls, Elizabeth turned back to her computer, starting a detailed document of every interaction she'd had with William Thompson and his associates. 6 years of observations, suspicions, and carefully maintained records poured onto the screen. The truth would indeed save them all, but first it had to be told. As she typed, Elizabeth glanced at Matthew's latest drawing, pinned to her bulletin board, a family portrait showing him with Michael, standing in front of a house that looked remarkably like the Johnsons' old Boston home. She'd protected his dream of family this long. Now it was time to help make it reality. Dawn was breaking as she finished her statement, the most comprehensive record of William's corruption yet assembled. Tomorrow, she would take the stand at the custody hearing not as a reluctant witness, but as a warrior for justice. William Thompson was about to learn that some secrets refuse to stay buried, and some bonds can't be broken by even the most powerful men. James Cooper spread the newest evidence across Michael's office desk at midnight, the city lights twinkling below through floor-to-ceiling windows. "Robert Anderson," he said, tapping a photograph of a distinguished-looking man. "The real power behind William's trafficking operation. CEO of Horizon Ventures, and your brother-in-law's silent partner." Michael studied the photo, recognition dawning. "I know him. He was at my wedding. William introduced him as a family friend, said he was interested in real estate investments." "He's interested in a lot more than that." Cooper unveiled a complex organizational chart. "Anderson's built an empire on human trafficking disguised as international adoptions. William's legal firm provides the paperwork, while Horizon Ventures handles the money laundering." Elizabeth Parker, who had joined them with her own evidence, leaned forward. "That explains the pattern we've seen at St. Catherine's. Every few months, representatives from Anderson's charitable foundation would visit, always interested in specific children. Those same children would later be approved for overseas adoption through William's firm. But here's where it gets personal," Cooper continued, revealing more documents. "Anderson had a special interest in your family, Michael. Specifically, in your development projects along the Boston waterfront." Sarah Miller, still in her nurse's uniform from her shift, added her piece. "The night Andrea brought Matthew to the hospital, she mentioned a man named Robert. Said he was behind everything, that he'd destroy anyone who threatened his operation." Cooper nodded grimly. "Anderson had been pressuring you to sell those waterfront properties at a fraction of their value. When you refused, he decided to use more persuasive methods, but Andrea uncovered his plan before they could act." Michael's mind raced back to those final months. The persistent phone calls, the aggressive offers. "Anderson visited my office personally a week before the accident, said he could make things very difficult if I didn't cooperate." "He didn't expect Andrea to be investigating him," Cooper explained. "She discovered that Anderson's charitable foundation was a front for child trafficking. Families who refused to sell would have their children kidnapped, then miraculously find them after signing over their properties." Elizabeth pulled out her records. Over the past 6 years, 15 children from wealthy families came through St. Catherine's. All were adopted overseas within months. All their parents had valuable real estate holdings that were sold to Horizon Ventures subsidiaries. "Andrea was building a case," Cooper continued. "She had proof of Anderson's connection to at least 30 kidnappings. But when she tried to contact the FBI, she discovered Anderson had people inside law enforcement. That's when she realized she had to disappear." Sarah spoke up. "She chose St. Catherine's because of its connection to Anderson's foundation. Hide Matthew in plain sight, where they'd never think to look for him. It was brilliant, really." Michael struggled to process the scope of the conspiracy. But why is William making his move now? After 6 years. Cooper's expression darkened, because Anderson's planning something big, the entire Boston waterfront, transformed into luxury developments. Your old properties are the final piece they need. With Matthew as leverage, they could force you to sign everything over. "There's more," Elizabeth added quietly. "Anderson's foundation just submitted paperwork to take over St. Catherine's management. If they succeed, they'll have direct access to hundreds of vulnerable children." The implications hit Michael like a physical blow. This wasn't just about his family anymore. Anderson and William were planning to expand their operation, using St. Catherine's as a pipeline for their trafficking network. "We have less than 72 hours," Cooper stated flatly. "The custody hearing is Friday morning. William's judge will rubber-stamp his guardianship claim, and Matthew will disappear into Anderson's system, unless we stop them first," Michael finished, newfound determination in his voice. "We have evidence, witnesses, we can expose everything." Cooper's expression remained grave. "It won't be that simple. Anderson has judges, police, even FBI agents on his payroll. One wrong move, and we'll all disappear, including Matthew." "Then we don't make a wrong move," Michael declared. "Elizabeth, can you protect Matthew at St. Catherine's?" She nodded firmly. "We've already enhanced security. Sarah and I take turns watching him around the clock." "Good. Cooper, get everything ready. Every document, every witness, every piece of evidence. We're not just going to expose them, we're going to destroy them. For Andrea, for Matthew, for every child they've ever hurt. As the others left to prepare, Michael stood at his window, looking out over the city he'd helped build. Somewhere out there, Andrea was waiting, fighting her own battle against Anderson's empire. Soon they'd reunite their family and bring down the monsters who'd torn them apart. But first they had to survive the next 72 hours. The morning of the custody hearing dawned cold and grey. Michael arrived at the courthouse early, finding Robert Anderson waiting on the steps. The older man looked exactly as Michael remembered from the wedding, immaculately dressed, radiating quiet authority. Michael Anderson smiled, extending his hand. It's been too long. 6 years, I believe the implied threat hung in the air between them. Michael ignored the offered hand. Let's skip the pretense, Robert. I know everything about the trafficking, the property schemes, all of it. Walk away now, or I'll destroy you. Anderson's smile never wavered. My dear boy, do you really think you're the first to make such threats? Ask your wife how that worked out for her. He stepped closer, voice dropping. Though I must admit, Andrea proved more resilient than expected. Such a shame we never found her body. She's alive, Michael said quietly, and she's been gathering evidence against you for 6 years. One word from me and everything goes public. Ah, but you won't say that word, will you? Anderson's eyes hardened. Not with young Matthew's fate hanging in the balance. Such a remarkable boy. So like his father and his mother. Michael's hands clenched. Stay away from my son. Your son Anderson chuckled. According to all legal records, Joseph Johnson died 6 years ago. Matthew is a ward of the state, soon to be in the custody of his loving Uncle William, unless I sign over the waterfront properties, Michael finished. That's what this is really about, isn't it? Anderson spread his hands. Business is business. Sign the papers and Matthew stays at St. Catherine's, safe and sound. Refuse and well, there are many lovely families overseas eager to adopt a healthy American boy. You're a monster, Michael breathed. I'm a businessman, Anderson corrected, one who's given you a very generous offer. The papers are in William's office. You have until the hearing starts to make your decision. He turned to leave, then paused. Oh, and Michael, don't bother with the evidence you and Cooper have gathered. My associates are visiting his office right now. Tragic. How many files can be lost in a simple break-in? But Michael smiled, a cold expression that gave Anderson pause. You mean these files? He pulled out his phone, showing a live stream of Cooper's office empty, untouched. Your associates are currently having a lovely chat with the FBI. The real FBI. The real FBI, not your bought and paid for agents. Anderson's composure cracked slightly. You're bluffing. Am I? Michael stepped closer. 6 years, Robert. 6 years of Andrea gathering evidence, building cases, turning your people. Did you really think she was working alone? That Cooper was our only ally. He nodded toward a group of tourists photographing the courthouse. See that woman with the red scarf? One of Andrea's contacts in the Justice Department. The hot dog vendor on the corner. Interpol. You're done, Robert? Your empire ends today. Anderson's face contorted with rage. You fool. You have no idea what you're dealing with. One phone call, and Matthew disappears forever. Another, and Andrea's safe house in Vermont isn't so safe anymore. Yes, he smiled at Michael's shock. We know exactly where she is. No, came a familiar voice behind them. You don't. Anderson turned slowly. Andrea Johnson stood at the bottom of the courthouse steps, very much alive, very much on Vermont. Behind her were dozens of federal agents, removing their various disguises. Hello, Robert, she said calmly. Thank you for that lovely confession. I'm sure the grand jury will find it fascinating. She held up her phone, the recording light blinking. You can't. Anderson reached inside his jacket, but froze as weapons appeared around him. 6 years, Andrea continued, climbing the steps to stand beside Michael. 6 years of watching you destroy families, steal children, ruin lives. But you made one crucial mistake. She took Michael's hand. You underestimated the power of love. A mother's love. A father's love. The kind of love that makes you never stop fighting, never stop believing. Anderson looked around wildly as agents moved in. William will never let you win. He has judges' evidence. William confessed an hour ago, Cooper said, appearing with a thick file. Turns out even he has limits. Trafficking children was business, but threatening his own nephew. That crossed a line. As agents led Anderson away, Andrea turned to Michael, tears in her eyes. I'm so sorry for everything, for not telling you, for letting you believe. Michael pulled her close, 6 years of grief and longing pouring out in that embrace. You protected our son. You fought monsters. Never apologize for that. Speaking of our son, Andrea smiled through her tears. We have a custody hearing to attend, ready to get our family back. Hand in hand, they climbed the courthouse steps, leaving Anderson's shattered empire behind. Their battle wasn't over. There would be trials, testimonies, more conspirators to catch. But the hardest part was done. Love had won. Family had won. The truth had won. Inside the courthouse, Sarah Miller waited in a small conference room, her hands shaking as she reviewed her testimony. The last 6 years of secrets were about to come pouring out, but there was one final truth she hadn't shared with anyone, not even Elizabeth. When the door opened, she expected Cooper or the federal agents. Instead, Andrea Johnson walked in, looking exactly as she had that rainy night 6 years ago. Their eyes met in silent recognition. You never told them, did you? Andrea asked softly, sitting across from her. That we knew each other before, that you were more than just a random nurse that night. Sarah shook her head, tears welling up. How could I? Telling them you were my sister would have put everyone in danger. Even now, Robert Anderson's people are watching my daughter in Chicago, waiting to see if I betray them. Andrea reached across the table, squeezing her hand. Catherine's safe. FBI agents moved her an hour ago. You can tell the whole truth now. Sarah's relief came out in a sob. For 6 years she'd lived in constant fear, taking the night shift at St. Catherine's to protect Matthew while knowing her own child could pay the price for her loyalty. I should have helped you sooner, Sarah whispered. When you first discovered what William and Anderson were doing, I should have gone to the authorities with you. You did help me, Andrea assured her. You gave Matthew a safe haven, watched over him all these years. You risked everything to protect my son while living under Anderson's threats. The door opened again, and Michael entered. Sarah stood, wiping her eyes. Michael, there's something you need to know before the hearing. She pulled out an old photograph, 2 young girls in graduation caps, arms around each other. Andrea and I aren't just old friends. We're sisters. Michael sank into a chair, understanding dawning. That's why you look so familiar when we met at the hospital. Why Matthew has some of your features too. Sarah nodded. Our parents divorced when we were young. I took our mother's name, Miller. Andrea stayed Thompson with our father and William. When she uncovered Anderson's trafficking operation, I was the only one she could trust completely. William never knew we stayed in contact, Andrea added. After the divorce, he shut out everyone from our mother's side of the family. That's why Sarah was perfect, the last person he'd suspect of helping me. But it came at a terrible cost, Sarah continued. Anderson discovered my connection to Catherine. He threatened to make her disappear into his trafficking network if I ever told anyone what I knew. So I stayed silent, working nights at St. Catherine's, watching Matthew grow up without being able to tell him I was his aunt. Michael stood, pulling Sarah into a hug. Your family will protect Catherine the same way you protected Matthew. Sarah stepped back, squaring her shoulders. There's more. The night of the accident, I wasn't just at the hospital by chance. Andrea and I had planned everything, the escape route, the fake records, even the timing of my shifts. But someone else knew too. Who? Andrea asked sharply. Mum, Sarah replied softly. She's the one who helped me get the job at St. Catherine's, who set up the safe house for Catherine. She's been working all these years to gather evidence against Anderson's operation, using her connections in social services. Fresh tears fell as Sarah continued. She died last month, a supposed car accident. Her last message to me was about documents she'd hidden, proof of Anderson's entire network. I retrieved them last night. She pulled out a USB drive. Everything's here: names, dates, bank accounts. Mom died to protect this information. Andrea covered her mouth, grief and guilt washing over her face. I never knew. All this time, she was fighting for us, and I never knew. She understood, Sarah assured her. She wanted you safe, wanted Matthew safe, and now her sacrifice will help bring down the people who destroyed our family. The conference room door opened once more. Cooper entered with federal agents, ready to take Sarah's testimony. She stood straighter, years of fear falling away. I'm ready, she declared, ready to tell everything. About Anderson, about William's involvement, about how our mother gave her life to expose their crimes. Matthew isn't the only child who deserves justice. As Sarah began her testimony, Andrea and Michael listened in awe of her courage. She named names, provided dates, connected dots that had eluded investigators for years. Her voice grew stronger with each revelation, each secret finally brought to light. When she finished, Sarah looked drained but peaceful. Catherine, I can't hide anymore after this. Anderson's people will never stop hunting us. You don't have to hide, Michael said firmly. You're coming home with us, both of you. Family stays together. Sarah looked at her sister, seeing the same determination in Andrea's eyes. After 6 years of shadows and separation, they were finally ready to stand in the light together. William Thompson sat alone in his office, staring at the leather-bound journal on his desk. He'd found it hidden in Andrea's old music box, delivered anonymously that morning. His sister's elegant handwriting filled every page, telling a story that shattered his world. Dearest William, the first entry began, if you're reading this, something has gone terribly wrong. Or perhaps, finally, something has gone right. You deserve to know the truth about Robert Anderson, about the children, about everything I discovered. His hands trembled as he read Andrea's detailed account of uncovering Anderson's trafficking operation. She described following money trails, connecting disappearances to property deals, realizing the horrible truth about their family friend's charitable foundation. I wanted to tell you, she wrote. But then I saw your name on documents, your signature authorizing adoptions. I prayed you were an unwitting participant, that Anderson had deceived you as he deceived so many others. William's coffee grew cold as he read about Andrea's desperate attempts to gather evidence. She'd discovered that Anderson was using William's law firm to legitimize his operation, exploiting his trust and ambition. The night I confronted Anderson, he laughed, said you were too valuable to waste, too ambitious to question where the money came from. He showed me photos of you at meetings I hadn't known about, deals I didn't understand. Your brother chose his side, he told me. Choose yours. Tears fell on the pages as William remembered those meetings. Anderson presenting opportunities, explaining away irregularities, always emphasizing the greater good of their work. He believed they were helping children find homes, believed the property deals were just smart business. I couldn't bear to think you knew, Andrea's words continued. My big brother, who taught me to ride a bike, who defended me from bullies, who cried at my wedding despite pretending to disapprove. So I investigated alone, gathering proof while pretending everything was normal. The journal detailed her growing horror as she uncovered the full scope of Anderson's operation. Children taken from wealthy families, properties acquired through extortion, a network reaching into law enforcement and government. When I discovered I was pregnant, everything changed. Suddenly the risk wasn't just to me. Anderson had to be stopped, but I couldn't trust anyone, not the police, not our father's friends, not even you. especially not you." William's hands shook as he read about the night of the accident. It hadn't been an accident at all, but an elaborate plan to protect Joseph and continue fighting Anderson's empire. "Sarah helped me disappear." "Our sister, yes, William. The one you pushed away after the divorce risked everything to save your nephew. While you spent 6 years blaming Michael, she spent 6 years protecting your family." The truth hit William like physical blows. Every accusation he'd hurled at Michael, every legal obstacle he'd created, every suspicious whisper he'd spread, all of it had helped Anderson maintain his power. "I watch you sometimes, at Father's Club or charity events. I see Anderson's influence growing, see you becoming more entangled in his web. It breaks my heart, knowing you believe you're doing good while he uses your reputation to hurt more families." At the end, Andrea's tone changed from sorrow to hope. "But I still believe in you, big brother. The William who taught me right from wrong hasn't disappeared. He's just lost his way. When you find this journal, remember who you were before Anderson. Remember the brother I love." The final entry was dated just days ago. The endgame approaches. Anderson's getting careless, expanding too quickly. He plans to use Matthew, your nephew, as leverage against Michael. But he doesn't know what's coming. Choose wisely, William. Choose family. William closed the journal, his world in pieces. Decades of reputation, of careful career building, all built on a foundation of stolen children and broken families. He'd become the very thing Andrea had fought against. His phone buzzed Anderson's number, probably calling about the custody hearing, about using William's legal expertise to gain control of Matthew. His hand hovered over the answer button. Then he looked at the family photo on his desk, Andrea at her wedding, radiant in white, his arm around her shoulders. They were both smiling, both innocent of what lay ahead. He'd sworn that day to always protect his little sister. William picked up his phone, but dialed a different number. "Cooper? I'm ready to talk. About everything. Anderson, the trafficking, all of it. I choose family." Within an hour, federal agents filled his office recording his confession. He named names, provided documents, unlocked every dark secret he'd helped hide. With each revelation, the weight of guilt lifted slightly, replaced by determination to make things right. As dawn broke over Boston, William Thompson stood at his office window, Andrea's journal clutched to his chest. He'd lost his way, but she'd never lost faith in him. Now, with the custody hearing approaching, he had one chance to prove her right. One chance to be the brother she deserved, the uncle Matthew needed, the man he'd forgotten how to be. The evening before the custody hearing, Michael left Cooper's office late, his briefcase heavy with evidence for the next day's proceedings. The parking garage was eerily quiet, his footsteps echoing between concrete pillars. He was so focused on tomorrow's strategy that he almost missed the reflection in a car window, a shadow moving where no shadow should be. His military training from years ago kicked in. Michael dropped and rolled as the first bullet shattered the window above him. Glass rained down as he scrambled behind a concrete pillar, heart pounding. 2 more shots cracked through the garage, the echoes making it impossible to pinpoint the shooter's location. "Just business," Mr. Johnson, a voice called out, professional and cold. "Nothing personal. Mr. Anderson simply can't risk tomorrow's hearing." Footsteps approached slowly, deliberately. The shooter was confident, unhurried. Michael's mind raced. His car was 20 yards away, the garage exit even further. The elevator would be suicide. His phone was in his briefcase, dropped in that first dive for cover. The evidence, everything they'd gathered against Anderson, scattered across the garage floor. Another shot struck the pillar, sending concrete chips flying. "Make it easy on yourself. Quick and clean. Otherwise I'll have to visit St. Catherine's next. Children have so many accidents these days." The threat against Matthew cleared Michael's mind instantly. He wasn't just fighting for his life, he was fighting for his son's future. The shooter's voice had come closer. In the dimness, Michael could see his reflection in a car's hubcap, approaching from the left. Michael removed his tie, waiting. When the shooter rounded the pillar, he was met with empty space. The momentary confusion was all Michael needed. He dropped from above, having used his tie to pull himself up the pillar. They crashed together, the gun skittering across the concrete. The assassin was skilled, professionally trained. His elbow caught Michael's ribs with crushing force. They grappled in the darkness, each seeking advantage. Michael took several hard blows, tasting blood, but he had something the shooter didn't, a reason to survive that went beyond money. My son Michael growled, blocking a strike and countering with a desperate punch. Will never another hit. Be afraid. The shooter staggered. Again the final blow sent the man crashing into a car, setting off its alarm. But the assassin wasn't finished. He pulled a knife, blade glinting in the garage's fluorescent lights. Anderson said you might be difficult. That's why I brought options. They circled each other, the car alarm's wail masking the approach of footsteps from the stairwell. The knife darted in, opening a cut on Michael's arm. He fell back, searching for anything to use as a weapon. His hand found his fallen briefcase. As the killer lunged, Michael swung it upward with all his strength. The heavy case connected with a satisfying crack. The assassin stumbled, but his knife slashed again, catching Michael's side. Both men were bleeding now, their breaths harsh in the enclosed space. The killer smiled, a cold expression. Last chance, Mr. Johnson. Think of your son. I am Michael, replied. Then he charged. They went down hard, wrestling for the knife. Michael felt it pierce his shoulder but didn't let go. They rolled across scattered papers, evidence of Anderson's crimes mixing with their blood. The killer got the upper hand, knife rising for a final strike. Michael saw Matthew's face flash before his eyes, saw Andrea's sacrifice, saw 6 years of lost time. No, he whispered. Not again. The garage exploded with light and sound. FBI. Drop the weapon, Cooper's voice rang out, accompanied by the sound of multiple weapons being cocked. The killer froze, then slowly raised his hands. As agents swarmed the garage, Cooper helped Michael up. Cutting it a bit close, Michael gasped, pressing a hand to his bleeding shoulder. Had to let him make his move, Cooper replied, nodding to surveillance equipment hidden in the ceiling. Now we have proof Anderson ordered a hit. One more nail in his coffin. Paramedics rushed in, but Michael waved them off temporarily. He knelt painfully, gathering the scattered evidence. Tomorrow's hearing would proceed as planned. Anderson's assassin had failed in his mission, but succeeded in strengthening their case. As he finally let himself be led to an ambulance, Michael touched the wound in his shoulder, a reminder that some things were worth bleeding for. Tomorrow he would face Anderson in court, these fresh injuries testament to the lengths their enemy would go to maintain power. But tonight's victory proved something crucial: love for family was stronger than fear of death. The night before the custody hearing erupted into chaos at St. Catherine's. Elizabeth's scream pierced the darkness at 2 a.m., followed by the sound of breaking glass. Sarah Miller, working her night shift, rushed to Matthew's room to find the window shattered and the bed empty. A rope ladder hung from the frame, swaying in the cold wind. No, Sarah ran to the window, catching a glimpse of dark figures loading a struggling form into a black SUV. She immediately hit the panic button Elizabeth had installed, setting off the orphanage's new security system. But by the time police arrived, the kidnappers had vanished with Matthew into the night. Elizabeth found a note pinned to Matthew's pillow: the hearing is cancelled. The boy joins our international family unless Mr. Johnson reconsiders his position. Anderson sends regards. The paper crumpled in her shaking hands as she called Michael at the hospital. They have him, she choked out when Michael answered. Anderson's men took Matthew. They left a note she couldn't continue, overcome with guilt and fear. Michael's voice, though strained from his injuries, carried steel. Call Cooper. Tell him to activate the tracker. Tracker? Elizabeth asked, confused. In Matthew's new watch, the birthday gift I gave him yesterday. Cooper suggested it, just in case. Get everyone to the command center at FBI headquarters. And Elizabeth, this isn't your fault. Within an hour, the FBI's command center hummed with activity. Multiple screens showed a blinking dot moving through the city. Michael, against medical advice, sat watching the tracker's signal, his bandaged shoulder a testament to Anderson's earlier attempt to stop him. They're heading toward the private airfield, Cooper announced, directing teams to intercept. Anderson has a cargo plane scheduled for departure in 30 minutes. Destination Eastern Europe. Sarah gripped Andrea's hand as they watched the dot move closer to the airport. He must be so scared, she whispered, all alone with those men. But Andrea smiled slightly, remembering her son's strength. He's not scared, he's angry, and he's smarter than they know. She was right. The first team to reach the airfield reported chaos. Somehow Matthew had managed to unlock his seatbelt, kick one kidnapper in the face, and spray another with a water bottle he'd hidden in his pajamas. In the confusion, he'd rolled out of the moving vehicle. That's my boy, Michael breathed, watching multiple agents converge on the scene. Just like his mother never stops fighting. The radio crackled. Subject is safe. Repeat, we have the child relief flooded the room, but it was short-lived. Another voice cut through second vehicle spotted. Black SUV heading for alternate airstrip. Anderson, Cooper growled. He's trying to flee before we can arrest him. Michael stood, ignoring the pain in his shoulder. Not this time. He doesn't get to run. Not after this, he turned to Andrea. Stay with Matthew. I'm ending this. The chase that followed would become FBI legend. Anderson's SUV weaved through Boston's streets, but Michael and Cooper had planned for this. Police roadblocks channeled the vehicle exactly where they wanted, toward the same waterfront properties that had started everything. Anderson's driver, facing a dead end at the pier, slammed on the brakes. Anderson emerged, wild-eyed, waving a gun. Stay back. I'll shoot. No, you won't, Michael said calmly, stepping into the floodlights. It's over, Robert. The game, the empire, all of it. But you crossed a line when you touched my son. Your son Anderson laughed manically. Joseph Johnson is dead. I made sure of that 6 years ago. That boy is just another commodity, another piece in the game. His confession, caught on multiple body cameras, was the final nail in his coffin. As FBI agents swarmed the pier, Anderson made one last desperate move. He turned his gun toward Michael, finger tightening on the trigger. A shot rang out, but it was Anderson who fell, clutching his shoulder. William Thompson lowered his smoking gun, face grim. That's for my sister, you bastard. As agents handcuffed Anderson, Michael's phone buzzed. A text from Andrea Matthews asking for you? Says he has something to show you. Michael smiled, imagining his son's proud grin as he explained his escape. The night's terror was over, but it had proved something vital: the bonds of family couldn't be broken by fear or force. Matthew hadn't just survived the kidnapping, he'd fought back, just as they'd all fought for 6 years. Like father, like mother, like son, fighters, every one of them. In the chaos of Matthew's kidnapping and rescue, no one noticed Elizabeth Parker following Anderson's men to the airfield alone. She'd slipped away from St. Catherine's, driven by guilt and determination, arriving just as Matthew made his daring escape from the kidnapper's vehicle. Elizabeth saw what the FBI agents didn't: a third kidnapper emerging from the shadows, weapon raised as Matthew ran for cover. Without hesitation, she threw herself between the child and the gun. The shot echoed across the airfield, and Elizabeth crumpled to the ground. Miss Parker, Matthew screamed, trying to run to her. FBI agents swarmed the scene, taking down the shooter as others rushed to Elizabeth's aid. Blood spread across her blouse, but she maintained consciousness, reaching for Matthew's hand. I promised to keep you safe, she whispered through pale lips. 6 years ago I made that promise to your mother. Had had to keep it. Her eyes fluttered as paramedics arrived, quickly assessing the wound. Sarah Miller, who had followed in her car, took charge of the medical response. Single gunshot wound to the upper chest. We need immediate transport. Her nursing training kicked in as she helped stabilize Elizabeth for the ambulance. Matthew refused to leave Elizabeth's side, his small hand clutching hers. "You have to be okay," he pleaded. "You're the only mom I've had for 6 years. Please don't leave me too." Elizabeth managed a weak smile. "You have. Your real mother now. Better than any story I could have told you." Her voice grew fainter as blood loss took its toll. The next 12 hours were a blur of hospital corridors and waiting rooms. Michael and Andrea took turns comforting Matthew, who insisted on staying until he knew Elizabeth would survive. Cooper coordinated security, ensuring Anderson's remaining associates couldn't reach her. Finally, the surgeon emerged, still in scrubs. The bullet missed her heart by centimeters. "She's stable, but it was close." Another inch to the left, he let the implication hang in the air. When Elizabeth regained consciousness, she found her hospital room filled with flowers and drawings, Matthew's work. The boy himself was curled up in a chair beside her bed, refusing to leave even after she was out of danger. "You saved my life," Matthew said simply when she opened her eyes. "Just like you've been saving me all along." Andrea stepped forward, tears in her eyes. "6 years ago, I trusted you with my most precious gift. You didn't just protect him, you gave him love, stability, a chance at happiness. We can never repay that." Elizabeth tried to speak, but Michael raised a hand. "There's more. The FBI found documents in Anderson's office plans to use St. Catherine's as a hub for his trafficking operation. Your instincts about him were right. You saved not just Matthew, but every child in your care." "The children," Elizabeth whispered, attempting to sit up. "Who's watching?" "I am," Sarah assured her. "Everything's under control. The only thing you need to focus on is healing." Elizabeth relaxed slightly, but her eyes remained troubled. "I should have told you everything sooner. About the night Matthew came to us, about Andrea's visits over the years, about Anderson's threats. Maybe then Anderson would have hurt you sooner," Andrea finished gently. "You did exactly what was needed. You kept our son safe until we could protect him ourselves." Matthew climbed carefully onto the bed, mindful of Elizabeth's injury. "Does this mean I have to say goodbye?" His voice trembled. "Now that I have my real parents back." Elizabeth met Andrea's eyes, seeing her own thoughts reflected there. "No, sweetheart," Andrea answered. "Miss Parker will always be part of our family. She's earned that right with her blood and her love." Michael nodded in agreement. "The custody hearing is tomorrow. Once everything's official, we'd like you to be Matthew's godmother, if you're willing." Elizabeth's eyes filled with tears of joy. After 6 years of secrets and fear, after taking a bullet to protect a child she'd come to love as her own, she was being offered something precious, a permanent place in Matthew's life. "Yes," she whispered, squeezing Matthew's hand. "Yes to all of it." As the others left to let her rest, Matthew lingered for one last hug. "Thank you for saving me," he murmured, "both times." Elizabeth smiled, remembering that rainy night 6 years ago when a desperate mother had entrusted her with a precious bundle. Some wounds were worth bearing, some risks worth taking, when love was at stake. At the custody hearing, Andrea's testimony unraveled 6 years of careful investigation into Robert Anderson's criminal empire. The courtroom fell silent as she laid bare the elaborate web of corruption and trafficking that had forced her into hiding. It began with discrepancies in the charity foundation's records, Andrea explained, her voice steady. Children from wealthy families disappearing, only to reappear after their parents signed over valuable properties to Anderson's shell companies. The pattern was too precise to be coincidence. She produced a leather-bound journal, its pages thick with photographs, bank statements, and handwritten observations. "I tracked 18 cases before discovering William's involvement. Each followed the same template: a child would vanish, the parents would receive untraceable demands, and Horizon Ventures would acquire prime real estate at a fraction of its value. The evidence was meticulous. Andrea had photographed secret meetings, recorded conversations, and mapped the entire trafficking network. She'd followed money trails through offshore accounts, documented Anderson's connections to corrupt officials, and identified the foreign buyers who purchased trafficked children. When I realized the scope of his operation, I knew going to the authorities wasn't an option, she continued. Anderson had judges in his pocket, police commanders on his payroll. The FBI agent I trusted was murdered the day before our meeting. Her voice cracked slightly when describing the night of the accident. We knew they were coming for Joseph. Anderson's men had already visited our home, asking pointed questions about our son's routine. The threat was clear: either Michael would sign over the waterfront properties, or our baby would disappear. The courtroom watched in stunned silence as Andrea revealed how she'd orchestrated her own disappearance. Sarah Miller, my sister, helped fake medical records showing Joseph and I had died in the crash. While Michael was unconscious in the hospital, we planted evidence to make it appear our bodies had been swept away by the river. Photographs showed Andrea's journey over the next 6 years: disguised appearances at trafficking sites, meetings with other parents of missing children, careful documentation of Anderson's expanding operation. She'd created a network of survivors and whistleblowers, all working to expose the truth. The hardest part wasn't the danger, Andrea admitted, tears finally falling. It was watching Michael grieve, seeing our son grow up from a distance, knowing William was using our disappearance to torment an innocent man. But we had to wait until we had enough evidence to bring down not just Anderson, but the entire network. Her testimony revealed how she'd turned Anderson's own people against him. Corrupt officials, faced with evidence of their crimes, became informants. Former trafficking victims came forward with their stories. Even Anderson's private security team had eventually helped gather evidence against their employer. We couldn't risk coming forward until we were certain Matthew would be safe, Andrea explained. Anderson had to believe he'd won, had to think his power was absolute. Only then would he become careless enough to expose his entire operation. The most damning evidence came from Anderson's own records. Andrea had secretly photographed documents showing how he'd planned to use St. Catherine's as a new trafficking hub, with William unknowingly providing legal cover through his firm. The attack on Elizabeth Parker proved we were right to wait, Andrea concluded. Anderson was willing to kill to protect his secrets. If we'd moved too soon, more innocent people would have died. As she finished testifying, Andrea looked directly at Michael. I know the cost of my choice. 6 years of separation, of letting you believe we were dead. But Anderson had to be stopped, had to face justice for all the families he destroyed. I only hope. Her voice faltered. I hope you can forgive me for choosing this path. Michael crossed the courtroom, taking her hand. You protected our son, he said simply. You fought monsters while I built buildings. There's nothing to forgive. The judge, moved by Andrea's testimony and the mountain of evidence, immediately granted full custody of Matthew to his parents. But more importantly, he ordered the arrest of Anderson's remaining conspirators, freezing assets and shutting down the trafficking network. As they left the courtroom, Andrea carried more than just custody papers. She carried vindication for 6 years of sacrifice, proof that sometimes the hardest choices are the right ones, and hope for all the families still searching for justice. The truth had finally set them free. Following Andrea's testimony, Sarah Miller took the stand, her revelation sending fresh shockwaves through the courtroom. The quiet nurse who had protected Matthew for 6 years was about to share her own extraordinary story of sacrifice and loyalty. My real name is Sarah Thompson Miller, she began, her voice trembling slightly. I am Andrea's half-sister, though few people knew of this connection. When our parents divorced, I stayed with our mother while Andrea and William remained with our father. William, in his bitterness, erased all traces of our mother's family from their lives. The courtroom murmured as Sarah described growing up watching her sister from afar, maintaining secret contact through coded messages and brief meetings. Even at Andrea's wedding to Michael, she had attended as a distant cousin, William too caught up in his disapproval to notice the resemblance between the sisters. When Andrea discovered Anderson's trafficking operation, I was the only person she could trust completely, Sarah continued. As a nurse at Boston General, I had access to medical records, could track suspicious patient transfers, and notice patterns that others missed. Together, we built a case against Anderson, documenting every disappeared child, every coerced property deal. She produced medical files spanning 6 years' evidence of children admitted with suspicious injuries, records altered to hide trafficking victims, death certificates falsified to cover Anderson's tracks. Her position had made her the perfect spy within the system. The night of the accident, everything was carefully planned, Sarah revealed. I was on duty specifically to help Andrea and Joseph disappear. We had mere minutes to fake their deaths before Anderson's people arrived at the hospital. The hardest part was knowing we couldn't tell Michael his genuine grief, had to convince everyone, especially William. Tears fell as Sarah described watching Matthew grow up at St. Catherine's, unable to acknowledge their true relationship. Every time he smiled, I saw Andrea. Every time he showed kindness to younger children, I saw our mother. Keeping my distance, pretending to be just another nurse, was a daily torment. The court learned how Sarah had balanced protecting Matthew with gathering evidence. Her night shifts at St. Catherine's weren't just about watching over her nephew, they provided cover for documenting Anderson's ongoing crimes, photographing suspicious adoptions, and maintaining contact with Andrea through elaborate dead drops. Anderson discovered my connection eventually, she admitted. He threatened my daughter Catherine, said she would disappear into his trafficking network if I ever revealed what I knew. For years I lived in terror, knowing one wrong move could doom both our children. Sarah's voice strengthened as she described the network of allies they'd built, other nurses, social workers, even former trafficking victims who had aged out of Anderson's system. Each played a small part in gathering evidence, creating a web of witnesses that would eventually bring down the entire operation. The night Matthew was kidnapped, I wasn't just fighting for my nephew, Sarah declared. I was fighting for every child Anderson had ever stolen, for every family his greed had destroyed. When Elizabeth took that bullet, she wasn't just protecting Matthew, she was protecting the truth we had all sacrificed to preserve. Looking at William, Sarah's expression softened. Our brother thought he was pursuing justice for Andrea, never realizing he was helping the very people who had threatened his family. His love for our sister was twisted by Anderson's manipulation, used to maintain the very system that had forced her into hiding. The judge listened intently as Sarah detailed how they had finally assembled enough evidence to move against Anderson. The coincidence of Michael discovering Matthew had accelerated their timeline, forcing them to reveal the truth before all the pieces were in place. We knew exposing Anderson would be dangerous, she concluded, but watching Matthew with Michael, seeing their natural bond grow despite 6 years of separation, made us realize we couldn't wait any longer. Some truths demand to be told, no matter the cost. As Sarah stepped down from the witness stand, she moved to sit beside her sister for the first time in public. Andrea grasped her hand, years of shared secrets and sacrifice flowing between them. Michael reached over, squeezing both their shoulders, acknowledging the debt he owed these remarkable sisters. Matthew, watching from his seat, finally understood why Sarah's smile had always seemed so familiar. He had not just regained parents, he had discovered an entire family that had sacrificed everything to keep him safe. William Thompson's moment of redemption came when he took the stand as the final witness. Gone was the polished corporate lawyer, in his place sat a broken man seeking absolution. I was blind, he began, his voice rough with emotion. For 6 years I channeled my grief into hatred, blaming Michael for a tragedy that Anderson had orchestrated. I became the very thing my sister was fighting against, a tool for monsters who preyed on innocent families. The courtroom fell silent as William detailed his unwitting role in Anderson's operation. His prestigious law firm had provided legitimate cover for trafficking operations, his reputation lending credibility to suspicious adoptions. Each signature he'd provided had sent another child into Anderson's network. I discovered Andrea's journal the night before Matthew's kidnapping, he continued, pulling out the worn leather book. Reading her words, seeing how Anderson had manipulated me, used my love for my sister as a weapon, I finally understood the magnitude of my failure. William's voice broke as he addressed Michael directly. You were never the enemy. While I was persecuting you, spreading suspicions, you were doing what I should have done, protecting my nephew. I let my prejudices, my class superiority, blind me to the truth about Anderson, and I nearly lost my family forever because of it. The evidence William provided was devastating. Internal memos, offshore account details, recordings of conversations with Anderson, everything he'd gathered once the truth became clear. His testimony transformed him from accomplice to key witness, his insider knowledge helping seal Anderson's fate. Matthew, he said, turning to his nephew, I spent 6 years trying to destroy your father's reputation, never knowing I was attacking my own blood. Your mother believed I would eventually see the truth. She never lost faith in me, even when I'd lost faith in myself. Tears fell freely as William described the moment he'd recognized Matthew at St. Catherine's. He has Andrea's eyes, her spirit. I saw it that day, but refused to acknowledge it. My pride, my anger, kept me from seeing what was right in front of me. The most powerful moment came when William addressed Elizabeth Parker, still recovering from her gunshot wound. You did what I failed to do. You protected my family without asking for recognition or reward. You took a bullet to save my nephew while I was still working for the man who wanted him harmed. His final revelation stunned the court. William had secretly recorded Anderson confessing to orchestrating the original accident, planning Matthew's kidnapping, and ordering the hit on Michael. The recording had cost him everything: his law partnership, his reputation, his fortune, but had given him something far more valuable: a chance at redemption. I can't undo the damage I've caused, William concluded. I can't give back the 6 years my sister spent in hiding, or the childhood my nephew lost, but I can ensure Anderson and his network never hurt another family again. As William stepped down, Andrea rose to meet him. For a moment, brother and sister stood facing each other, 6 years of pain and misunderstanding between them. Then Andrea pulled him into a fierce embrace. Welcome back, big brother, she whispered. Michael joined them, extending his hand to his brother-in-law. William took it, then found himself drawn into the embrace. Matthew, watching his family reunite, slipped from his seat to join them. Does this mean you're really my uncle? He asked William. William knelt before his nephew, seeing Andrea's hopeful smile reflected in the boy's face. If you'll have me, he replied, I have a lot to make up for. Matthew considered this, then took William's hand. Mum always said family deserves second chances. The judge, witnessing this reconciliation, delivered his final ruling. Not only would Matthew return to his parents, but all of Anderson's illegal adoptions would be reviewed, giving other families hope of reunion. William's testimony had ensured that justice would extend beyond one family's story. As they left the courtroom together, William carrying his nephew on his shoulders, Andrea saw her family whole for the first time in 6 years. Her brother had found his way back to them, just as she'd always believed he would. Sometimes, she realized, the greatest victories come not from defeating enemies, but from healing the wounds within our own hearts. Robert Anderson's empire crumbled in the bright lights of a federal courtroom. The evidence presented by Andrea, Sarah, and William proved devastating: decades of trafficking, extortion, and violence exposed to the world. His perfect facade of philanthropy shattered, revealing the monster beneath. The prosecution presented 78 cases of child trafficking, each meticulously documented in Andrea's journals. Parents came forward to testify, describing how Anderson had stolen their children, forced property deals, and destroyed families. Many wept as they identified their children in photographs found in Anderson's private files. The defendant preyed on society's most vulnerable, the prosecutor declared. He turned family love into a weapon, children into commodities, and trust into a tool of exploitation. His crimes demand the maximum penalty under law. Anderson maintained his arrogant demeanor until William took the stand. His former partner's testimony revealed the elaborate system of shell companies, falsified documents, and corrupt officials that had protected the trafficking operation. As William detailed each transaction, each criminal connection, Anderson's composure cracked. "You fool," he shouted, lunging at William. "I made you. Without me, you're nothing." Federal marshals restrained him as he continued ranting, his true nature finally visible to all. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. The verdict, guilty on all counts, echoed through the courtroom like thunder. Anderson faced multiple life sentences, his wealth confiscated, his empire dismantled. But justice extended beyond one man. The investigation triggered by Andrea's evidence exposed corrupt officials across 3 states, judges who had approved suspicious adoptions, police who had buried investigations, politicians who had accepted bribes, all faced prosecution. Most importantly, Anderson's records provided hope for dozens of trafficked children. International task forces began tracking down victims, reuniting families torn apart by his greed. The first successful reunion, a girl from Boston found in Moscow, made headlines worldwide. William used his legal expertise one final time, establishing a foundation to support trafficking victims and their families. The organization, named in honor of Elizabeth Parker's courage, would ensure Anderson's wealth served the very people he had victimized. As Anderson was led away in handcuffs, Michael stood with his family: Andrea, Matthew, Sarah, William, and Elizabeth. They had lost 6 years to this man's evil, but their unity had ultimately brought him down. "It's really over," Andrea whispered, watching her former tormentor disappear behind prison doors. "No," Michael replied softly. "It's just beginning. Every family reunited, every child brought home, that's our real victory." Matthew, holding both his parents' hands, smiled up at them. "Can we go home now?" Home. After 6 years of shadows and fear, they could finally step into the light. Anderson's arrest hadn't just ended a criminal empire, it had freed them to be a family again. In the months following Anderson's conviction, the Johnson family began the delicate process of healing. Their new home, overlooking Boston Harbor, became a sanctuary where 6 years of lost time could slowly be reclaimed. Matthew's transition from orphanage to family life brought both joy and challenges. Some nights he would wake in panic, forgetting where he was. Andrea would sit with him, sharing stories of his babyhood, building bridges across the years they'd lost. Michael taught him to sail on weekends, their shared silence on the water healing wounds words couldn't touch. Elizabeth Parker became a constant presence in their lives, her recovery from the shooting marking her as family more surely than any legal document. She continued running St. Catherine's, but now with the Johnson Foundation's full support. Every Sunday she joined them for dinner, helping Matthew balance his past and present. Sarah moved into the guest house with her daughter Catherine, the cousins forming an instant bond. The 2 children, both marked by Anderson's threats, helped each other heal through play and laughter. Their shared resilience became a symbol of the family's recovery. William's redemption came through quiet acts of devotion. He spent hours with Matthew, learning about his nephew's interests, attending every school event, making up for lost time with patient determination. The boy's gradual acceptance of his uncle helped heal the rift between William and Andrea. Most touching was Matthew's art therapy sessions, where he processed his complex emotions through drawing. His pictures evolved from dark, confused scenes to bright family portraits. One particular drawing showing everyone, including Elizabeth and Sarah, on a sailboat hung prominently in the living room. During quiet evenings, Andrea would hold Michael as they watched their son play, both marveling at his resilience. "He has your strength," Michael would say, and Andrea would reply, "and your heart." Their own relationship deepened through shared understanding of sacrifice and survival. The family hosted monthly gatherings for other reunited families from Anderson's network. These meetings became celebrations of healing, where parents and children could share their journeys with others who truly understood. Matthew took special pride in helping younger children adjust to their restored families. 1 year after the trial, they held a private ceremony in the garden. Matthew officially took back his birth name while keeping Matthew as his middle name, Joseph Matthew Johnson, a bridge between his past and future. Elizabeth and Sarah stood as his godmothers, William as godfather, the family circle finally complete. "We're different people now," Andrea reflected that evening, watching their extended family laugh together on the patio. "Stronger because we were broken, closer because we were apart." Michael squeezed her hand, understanding perfectly. Their journey had transformed them all, turning victims into survivors, strangers into family, pain into purpose. In healing together, they had created something more powerful than Anderson's evil could ever destroy: unshakable love. 1 year after Anderson's conviction, the Johnson family gathered at sunrise on the cliffside, overlooking the spot where their journey began. The accident site, once a place of tragedy, had been transformed into a memorial garden for trafficking victims. A bronze statue of a mother and child, designed from Matthew's drawings, stood as its centerpiece. Matthew, now 8, placed his latest drawing at the statue's base, a vibrant scene showing two paths merging into one. "It's us," he explained to his parents. "The dark path and the light path coming together." His artistic talent, inherited from Andrea, had become his way of telling their family's story. Andrea knelt beside their son, touching the inscription she'd chosen: "Love finds its way home." The words honored not just their journey, but the countless other families who had suffered under Anderson's reign. Thanks to the Johnson Foundation's efforts, 63 children had been reunited with their parents in the past year. Elizabeth Parker, fully recovered from her injury, continued her work at St. Catherine's, now a model for child protection and family reunification. The orphanage had become a sanctuary where traumatized families could heal together, its success inspiring similar programs nationwide. Sarah and Catherine had bloomed in their new life, free from Anderson's threats. Catherine's nightmares had faded, replaced by dreams of becoming a child rights attorney like her uncle William, who had dedicated his legal expertise to prosecuting trafficking cases. William, standing slightly apart, placed a single rose before the statue. His redemption continued through tireless work with trafficking survivors, his understanding of Anderson's methods helping authorities dismantle similar operations worldwide. Cooper had retired from private investigation but still consulted with the Foundation, his experience invaluable in tracking missing children. His wedding to Sarah the previous month had added another chapter to their expanding family story. As the sun rose fully, Michael gathered everyone for a photograph. The camera captured not just smiles, but the invisible bonds forged through trial and triumph: Andrea's arm protective around Matthew, Elizabeth and Sarah flanking them like guardians, William's hand resting supportively on his nephew's shoulder. "I used to dream about this," Matthew said suddenly. "At the orphanage. Having a whole family, I mean. But the real thing is better than any dream." Andrea hugged him close, sharing a knowing look with Michael. Their son had inherited more than her artistic talent. He had her spirit, her resilience, her capacity for forgiveness and love. The memorial garden had become a symbol of transformation, proving that even the darkest experiences could nurture growth and healing. Families from across the country visited, finding hope in the Johnson family's story. As they left the garden, Matthew ran ahead with Catherine, their laughter echoing across the cliffs. Behind them, the adults walked together, bound by choices made in love and sacrifice. They had learned that family isn't just about blood or birth, it's about the people who stand beside you in both darkness and light. The bronze mother and child watched over the garden, their eternal embrace promising all who visited that love could survive any separation, heal any wound, and light the way home through the darkest night. "Ready to go home?" Michael asked, taking Andrea's hand. She smiled, watching their son's joyful progress down the path. "We're already there." Thank you for joining us for this emotional journey of love, sacrifice, and redemption. If this story touched your heart, please take a moment to share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear what moments resonated with you most. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel to support our team and ensure you never miss our upcoming stories of hope and healing. Hit the like button if you enjoyed this video and share it with friends and family who might find inspiration in the Johnson family's journey. Your support helps us continue creating meaningful content that reminds us of the power of family bonds and the triumph of love over adversity. Together, we can spread these stories of courage and redemption to those who need them most.